Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who refused to surrender. The silence before the storm. Silence hung over Pine Mountain like a shroud on that April afternoon in 1945. Inside the modest white cottage perched atop the Georgia hillside, a man sat before a fireplace, his weathered hands resting on the arms of a leather chair. The spring sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across his gaunt face. At 63 years old, Franklin Delano Roosevelt appeared decades older, the weight of a wounded world etched into every line of his features. He was tired in a way that sleep could never cure. For 12 years, he had carried the burdens of a broken nation on shoulders that could barely support his own paralyzed body. He had guided America through its darkest economic nightmare and was now steering it toward victory in the most catastrophic war humanity had ever known. The presidency had consumed him, devoured him, transformed him into something both more and less than the privileged young man who had once sailed carefree across the Hudson River. Clang around him, the quiet sounds of life continued. His cousins chatted softly in adjacent rooms. An artist sketched his portrait, her brush moving across canvas with practiced efficiency. Outside, the warm Georgia air carried the scent of pine and dogwood blossoms. Everything seemed peaceful, almost ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about this moment, about this man, or about the journey that had brought him here. This was not how legends were supposed to end, in a modest cottage far from the marble halls of power, away from the thunderous applause of crowds and the weighty decisions of war rooms. Yet perhaps it was fitting, for Franklin Roosevelt had never been the man people expected him to be. Born into unimaginable wealth and privilege, he had become the champion of the forgotten. Struck down by a disease that should have ended his political dreams, he had risen to heights no American president had reached before or would reach again. Underestimated by his enemies, and sometimes even by his friends, he had reshaped the very fabric of his nation. The path that led to this quiet room in Warm Springs, Georgia, had been neither straight nor easy. It had wound through gilded mansions and desperate breadlines, through personal triumphs and devastating betrayals, through the deepest valleys of despair and the highest peaks of achievement. It was a journey that would define not just one man's life, but the course of the 20th century itself. To understand how America's longest-serving president came to sit in that chair on that fateful spring day, we must return to the beginning, to a world of wealth and comfort that seemed as distant from the struggles of common people as the stars from the earth. The Golden Cage. Unresolved. On January 30th, 1882, a difficult birth nearly claimed 2 lives at Springwood, the Roosevelt estate overlooking the Hudson River in Hyde Park, New York. Sarah Delano Roosevelt, 26 years younger than her husband James, endured a harrowing 24-hour labor. At one point, doctors administered too much chloroform, sending her into dangerous unconsciousness. When the baby finally emerged, he was motionless, blue, seemingly stillborn. Only the quick thinking of a physician who breathed air directly into the infant's lungs brought him sputtering back to life. That baby, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, entered a world most Americans could scarcely imagine. The Roosevelts and Delanos ranked among the wealthiest families in New York, their fortunes built over generations through shipping, coal, railroads, and even the opium trade. Springwood sprawled across hundreds of acres of prime Hudson Valley land, maintained by scores of servants and workers. The family divided their time between this country estate, a townhouse in Manhattan, and regular trips to Europe, where they moved comfortably among aristocrats and titled nobility. But this golden cage, for all its luxury, was also a prison of sorts. Franklin was Sarah's only child, and after her difficult delivery, doctors advised against future pregnancies. She poured all her formidable energy and fierce love into this one son, creating a relationship that would shape and sometimes suffocate him for the rest of her life. She dressed the toddler in dresses and kept his hair in long curls until he was nearly 6. She supervised every aspect of his existence with the attention of a master jeweler examining a precious stone. James Roosevelt, 54 when Franklin was born, was a more distant figure, though not unkind. He took his son riding through the estate, taught him to sail on the Hudson, and instilled in him a sense of noblesse oblige, the aristocratic duty to serve those less fortunate. In 1887, when Franklin was just 5, James brought him to Washington to meet President Grover Cleveland. The president looked down at the small boy and offered words that would echo through history with dark irony. "My little man," Cleveland said, patting Franklin's head, "I am making a strange wish for you. It is that you may never be President of the United States." Franklin's childhood was one of profound isolation. He had no siblings close to his age, only a half-brother from James's first marriage who was 27 years older. Until age 14, he never attended school with other children, instead receiving instruction from a succession of 8 governesses and private tutors. His playmates were servants' children, or the sons of neighboring wealthy families during brief, supervised visits. The world beyond Springwood's manicured lawns remained largely theoretical, known only through books and his parents' carefully curated stories. This sheltered existence left him utterly unprepared for the world he would eventually enter. When Sarah and James finally sent him to Groton School in Massachusetts in 1896, he crashed headlong into a social reality he could barely comprehend. Groton prided itself on molding the sons of America's elite into leaders through a rigid system of discipline, athletics, and academic competition. Most boys arrived at age 12. Franklin, entering at 14, was already behind in the unofficial hierarchies that governed student life. At Groton, popularity flowed to those who excelled at sports or displayed a rebellious streak. Franklin possessed neither quality. He was not athletic enough to make the varsity teams. He was not bold enough to challenge authority in the ways his peers found admirable. He was simply ordinary, in an environment where being ordinary meant being invisible. In letters home, he maintained a cheerful facade, but years later, he would admit the truth. "I always felt entirely out of things," he confessed. The headmaster, Endicott Peabody, did leave one lasting imprint on the young Roosevelt. Peabody preached a doctrine of Christian service and civic responsibility. He brought in speakers who discussed social reform and the obligations of the privileged toward the poor. These ideas planted seeds in Franklin's mind, though they would not truly germinate for many years to come. In 1900, Franklin enrolled at Harvard University, finally escaping his mother's direct supervision, though Sarah rented a house in Boston to remain close. At Harvard, he pursued popularity with the same determination that had eluded him at Groton. He ran for class offices and won. He became editor of the college newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. But his grades remained mediocre, and his greatest disappointment came when the exclusive Porcellian Club, which his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had joined, rejected his membership. Decades later, he would describe this rejection as perhaps the greatest disappointment of his life. Yet at Harvard, something far more significant than any club membership occurred. During his freshman year, Franklin's father James died. The loss was profound, but it also freed him in ways he had not anticipated. And in the spaces that grief created, something new began to grow. It was at a family gathering that he truly noticed her, his fifth cousin once removed. Eleanor Roosevelt was everything Franklin was not. Where he had been sheltered and privileged, she had known loss and hardship. Where he wore masks of charm and confidence, she possessed a seriousness that bordered on severity. Her mother, the beautiful Anna Hall Roosevelt, had considered Eleanor too plain to be anything but good. Both parents had died by the time Eleanor was 10, leaving her in the care of a strict grandmother. But there was something in Eleanor that called to Franklin, some quality that his surface charm could not quite capture. Perhaps he sensed in her a depth he lacked. Perhaps he recognized that she had already faced struggles he could not imagine. Whatever the reason, he began courting her in earnest during his final years at Harvard. When Franklin told his mother Sarah about his intention to marry Eleanor in 1903, her reaction was immediate and fierce. She did not approve. Eleanor was not the sophisticated, socially prominent woman Sarah had envisioned for her son. She tried to break up the relationship, even taking Franklin on a Caribbean cruise in a desperate attempt to change his mind. But for perhaps the first time in his life, Franklin defied his mother's will. He and Eleanor became engaged, and they were married on March 17, 1905, St. Patrick's Day. Slashing President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle and Franklin's distant cousin, gave away the bride. The ancient order of Hibernians paraded past outside, their singing drowning out the wedding vows. After the ceremony, Uncle Theodore held court, telling stories and dominating the reception as he dominated every room he entered. The bride and groom were almost forgotten in the excitement surrounding the President of the United States. But this marriage, which began in the shadow of Theodore Roosevelt's overwhelming personality, would eventually forge a partnership that would surpass even TR's legacy. It would be tested by betrayal, transformed by tragedy, and ultimately become one of the most consequential political alliances in American history. Franklin had escaped his golden cage, but the man who emerged was still unformed, still searching for purpose beyond charm and ambition. The crucible that would forge him into the leader his nation needed still lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of a future he could not possibly imagine. The Awakening. Franklin Roosevelt's marriage to Eleanor began with hope, but quickly revealed the chasm between them. Eleanor came to the marriage bed with virtually no education about physical intimacy, her understanding limited to cryptic biblical passages read aloud by her cousin Alice. For her, the marital act became an ordeal to be endured rather than shared. Between 1906 and 1916, she would bear 6 children, one of whom died in infancy, each pregnancy a burden that deepened her resigned attitude toward her husband's physical needs. Sarah Roosevelt made matters worse by maintaining her iron grip on her son's life even after his marriage. She purchased a townhouse in New York City for the newlyweds, but she also bought the house next door for herself, connecting them with adjoining doors. She furnished both homes to her own taste, selected the servants, and appeared at will to supervise Eleanor's household management and child-rearing. The young Eleanor, already unsure of herself, found herself trapped between a domineering mother-in-law and a husband who could not, or would not, stand up to his mother. Was building something beyond his domestic struggles. In 1910, at age 28, he made his first foray into politics, running for the New York State Senate from his traditionally Republican home district. He campaigned with energy and charm, traveling through Dutchess County in a red Maxwell touring car, giving speeches at every crossroads and village. He won, stunning the local Republican establishment. In Albany, Franklin learned the art of political theater. He positioned himself as a reform Democrat, fighting against the corrupt political machines that dominated New York politics. He was young, handsome, and carried the magical Roosevelt name. Newspapers took notice. One journalist in particular, Louis McHenry Howe, saw something special in the tall senator with the jutting jaw and pince-nez glasses. Howe, a gnome-like man with a face ravaged by illness and a mind sharp as a razor, attached himself to Franklin's rising star. He would remain devoted to Roosevelt for the rest of his life. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed Franklin as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position Theodore Roosevelt had held on his path to the presidency. Franklin loved the job with an almost childlike enthusiasm. The sea had always called to him, and now he commanded its instruments of power. He pushed for naval expansion, learned to navigate bureaucratic waters, and built relationships with labor leaders, businessmen, and members of Congress. He was learning, growing, becoming someone more than the privileged boy from Hyde Park. But he was also becoming reckless. Washington offered temptations that Springwood and Harvard had not. He moved in circles of power and influence, attending parties and social events where beautiful, sophisticated women found the young assistant secretary charming and available. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained largely at home with their growing brood of children, feeling increasingly disconnected from her husband's glittering life. In 1916, Franklin hired a new social secretary for Eleanor, a young woman named Lucy Mercer. She was beautiful, graceful, and from a once prominent family now fallen on hard times. She was also everything Eleanor was not: comfortable in social situations, easy with laughter, unencumbered by Eleanor's intense seriousness. Franklin noticed. Eleanor did not, at least not at first. The affair that developed between Franklin and Lucy Mercer was conducted with increasing boldness. They were seen together at social events when Eleanor was away. They took long drives through the Virginia countryside. Franklin's own daughter, Anna, later remembered seeing them together and sensing something she could not quite name. For nearly 2 years the affair continued, hidden by Franklin's charm and Lucy's discretion. In September 1918, Franklin returned from a trip to Europe inspecting naval facilities. He was desperately ill with influenza, part of the pandemic that would kill millions worldwide. Eleanor unpacked his bags and found letters from Lucy Mercer that left no doubt about their relationship. The discovery shattered her. What followed was a crisis that nearly destroyed the Roosevelt family. Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce, an almost unthinkable step in that era. But Sarah Roosevelt intervened with cold calculation. She told Franklin that if he divorced Eleanor, she would cut him off without a cent. His political career would be ruined. No divorced man could hope to achieve high office in 1918 America, and Lucy, a devout Catholic, could not marry a divorced man with 5 children. Franklin chose his ambition over his heart. He agreed to stay in the marriage under one condition that Eleanor demanded: he would never see Lucy Mercer again. Eleanor never forgave him, though she accepted the bargain. Their marriage transformed from that moment forward. The romantic partnership died, replaced by a political alliance built on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than love. Eleanor established her own residence at Valkill on the Hyde Park estate, created her own circle of friends, and began her own journey toward independence and purpose. For Franklin, the consequences ran deeper than he could have imagined. He had made a choice, and that choice would echo through the decades ahead. He had learned that he could not have everything, that even privilege has its limits, that actions have consequences. But the greatest consequence of all, the one that would truly forge him into the leader his nation needed, was still approaching. In the summer of 1921, exhausted from years of political striving and secret anguish, Franklin took his family to their vacation home on Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada. It was supposed to be a time of rest and recovery, a peaceful retreat from the disappointments of the world. 1920 election, where he had run unsuccessfully for vice president. Instead, it became the site of his greatest trial, a trial that would break his body but forge his character into something unbreakable. On Campobello Island, in the warm days of August, Franklin Roosevelt would die in one sense and be reborn in another, transformed by a disease that should have ended his ambitions, but instead became the crucible that made him capable of leading a nation through its darkest hours. The Crucible of Fire. August 10, 1921, began as an ordinary summer day on Campobello Island. The morning sun rose over the Bay of Fundy, casting its light across the Roosevelt family's vacation cottage. Franklin woke feeling vigorous, ready for adventure. He had been pushing himself hard lately, trying to outrun something he could not name, some dissatisfaction with his life, some sense of unfulfilled destiny. Submerged. That afternoon, Franklin took his children sailing in their small boat. On the way back, they spotted a forest fire on a nearby island. True to his nature, Franklin organized an impromptu firefighting expedition, leading his sons in beating back the flames with tree branches. Covered in soot and sweat, they returned home tired but exhilarated. but Franklin was not finished. He decided they should jog 2 miles to a freshwater lake for a swim. The water was pleasant, but not particularly refreshing, so they jogged back and plunged into the Bay of Fundy, where the water was shockingly cold. Then Franklin sat on the porch in his wet bathing suit, reading his mail as the breeze chilled his skin. He began to feel unwell. "I think I'll skip dinner and go to bed," he told Eleanor, his voice strange even to himself. By the next morning, Franklin's left leg felt weak and heavy. He tried to stand and nearly fell. By evening, his temperature had spiked to 102 degrees. Both legs were now useless, numb and unresponsive to his commands. Pain shot through his back and limbs like lightning. He could not control his bladder or bowels. He could not move without assistance. The strong, athletic man who had been fighting a forest fire just 24 hours earlier was now helpless as an infant. The local doctor, William Keene, examined Franklin and diagnosed a blood clot on the spinal cord. He prescribed vigorous massage of the paralyzed limbs. But Eleanor's uncle, Frederick Delano, suspicious of this diagnosis, contacted specialists at the Harvard Infantile Paralysis Commission. On August 25th, Dr. Robert Lovett arrived at Campobello. After examining Franklin, Lovett delivered the verdict that would change everything. Poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis, polio. Perpendicular was bewildering. Polio struck children, not 39-year-old men. But Lovett was certain. The paralysis, he explained, came from the polio virus attacking the nerve cells in Franklin's spinal cord. The massage Keene had prescribed was actually making things worse, damaging already compromised tissue. Franklin needed to stop fighting and let his body heal. For weeks, Franklin lay in bed on Campobello, unable to move his legs, barely able to shift his body. Eleanor became his nurse, handling his most intimate needs with the same determined competence she brought to everything else. She bathed him, emptied his bedpans, turned him to prevent bed sores, administered catheters and enemas. It was exhausting, degrading work for both of them, but Eleanor never faltered. Perhaps in caring for him in his complete vulnerability, she found a way to forgive him, or at least to move beyond the betrayal that had shattered her heart. In September, they managed to transport Franklin back to New York by boat and train, a harrowing journey that left him in agony. He spent 6 weeks in Presbyterian Hospital, then moved to the family townhouse, where Eleanor and the children made room for nurses and physical therapists. The prognosis was grim. Most patients who survived the acute phase of polio regained some function, but Franklin's paralysis was extensive. His legs were completely useless, his back muscles were weak. Even his arms and shoulders had lost strength. Louis Howe moved into the townhouse too, sleeping on a cot in the hallway. He understood what no one else quite grasped. Franklin's political career was over unless they could conceal the full extent of his disability from the public. No man in a wheelchair could be elected to high office. The American people would see him as weak, incapable, unfit to lead. So Howe began a campaign of deception that would last the rest of Franklin's life. But first, Franklin himself had to decide whether he even wanted to continue. For months, he struggled with depression so profound that some days he could not bring himself to face his guests with his usual cheerful mask. Missy LeHand, his secretary, remembered days when Franklin could not pull himself out of despair until noon. The man who had always been in motion, always sailing or swimming or striding confidently through crowds, was now trapped in a body that would not obey him. Killing, yet something in Franklin refused to accept defeat. Perhaps it was his mother's fierce optimism ground into him from childhood. Perhaps it was some essential stubbornness in his nature. Or perhaps his earlier struggles, his rejections and disappointments, had built in him a core of resilience that even polio could not break. Whatever the reason, Franklin chose to fight. The battle was brutal and largely private. Every morning, physical therapists put him through exercises that left him drenched in sweat. He wore heavy steel leg braces that weighed 10 pounds and extended from his hips to his heels, locking his legs in place so he could stand upright. He learned to walk, or rather, to create the illusion of walking, by pivoting his hips and swinging his locked legs forward while balancing precariously on a cane and someone's arm. One wrong move, one moment of lost balance, and he would crash to the floor, helpless and humiliated. He learned other skills too. He learned to conceal the enormous effort it took to move even a few feet. He learned to mask his pain with jokes and laughter. He learned to sit so that the braces did not show, to position himself so that photographers could not capture his wheelchair, to time his public appearances so that he was already seated before crowds arrived. He became an actor, playing the role of an able-bodied man, performing his part so convincingly that millions of Americans never fully understood the extent of his disability. But the transformation went deeper than physical adaptation. Polio stripped away Franklin's superficial charm and forced him to confront himself without the masks he had always worn. In the long hours of lying helpless, in the grinding daily struggle to accomplish tasks that had once been effortless, he developed something he had lacked before: empathy. He understood now what it meant to struggle, to face obstacles that seemed insurmountable, to depend on others for the most basic needs. He had joined, in a sense, the ranks of the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones society dismisses. Eleanor watched this transformation with growing respect. She had married a charming, somewhat shallow young man obsessed with his own advancement. The man emerging from the crucible of polio was different, deeper, more thoughtful, more genuinely interested in the struggles of others. When Eleanor began working with immigrant communities in New York's Lower East Side tenements, Franklin listened to her stories with real attention. When she described the poverty and desperation she witnessed, he did not turn away with aristocratic distaste, but instead asked questions, tried to understand. In 1924, Franklin heard about a resort in Georgia called Warm Springs. The natural mineral waters there, heated by underground sources, supposedly helped polio patients regain strength and mobility. Franklin visited and fell in love with the place. In the warm water, he could stand without braces, could move his legs with something approaching freedom. The water held him up when his body could not. He began spending months at a time at Warm Springs, eventually purchasing the entire resort with most of his personal fortune. He transformed it into a treatment center for polio patients, most of them children from poor families who could never have afforded such care. Franklin swam with them, encouraged them, shared their struggles. He was no longer the Assistant Secretary of the Navy or even the failed vice presidential candidate. He was just Frank, another polio patient trying to walk again. Erie's years away from politics, the years that forged Franklin Roosevelt into the man who could lead a broken nation. He learned patience in the endless repetition of exercises that produced tiny improvements measured in inches and ounces of strength. He learned determination in the daily choice to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. He learned humility in his complete dependence on others. And he learned joy in small victories, the ability to celebrate the moment when he could finally grip a glass with his weakened hand or stand upright for 30 seconds without swaying. Eleanor later reflected on these years with insight that captured something profound. Polio, she said, taught Franklin that, having gone through that, suffering and being afraid, and yet coming out of it, you could do anything you thought you should do or had to do. In 1924, Louis Howe convinced Franklin to make his first public appearance since polio struck. The Democratic National Convention was coming to New York, and Al Smith, the governor, needed someone to give his nominating speech. It was a perfect opportunity for Franklin to show the world he was still alive, still relevant, still a force to be reckoned with. But it was also terrifying. What if he fell? What if the crowd saw his weakness and turned away in pity or disgust? Franklin agreed to do it. On the appointed day, he prepared himself with the thoroughness of a general planning a crucial battle. He had his son Elliot practice walking with him repeatedly, learning exactly how much support to provide, how to move in perfect synchronization. He timed every step from his seat to the podium. He chose a cane that would bear his weight without wobbling. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that concealed his braces. When the moment came, 15,000 delegates watched as Franklin Roosevelt stood from his seat and began his journey to the podium. Each step was agony, each moment balanced on the edge of disaster. Sweat poured down his face, his jaw clenched with effort. But he kept moving, kept smiling, kept projecting confidence and strength. Elliot remembered the incredible tension in his father's arm, the trembling of muscles pushed beyond their limits. Then Franklin reached the podium and grasped it with his powerful arms and shoulders, the one part of his body that polio had spared. He looked out at the crowd and began to speak, his voice clear and strong, nominating Al Smith as the happy warrior. The delegates exploded in applause. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a man who refused to be defeated by the cruelest of fates. A reporter wrote, "Here on the stage is Franklin Roosevelt, a figure tall and proud even in suffering, pale with years of struggle against paralysis, a man softened and cleansed and illumined with pain." Franklin did not win his battle with polio. His legs never recovered. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair when cameras were not present, dependent on others to move him from place to place. But he won something more important. He won the battle for his soul. The disease that should have ended his ambitions instead prepared him for greatness. It transformed a charming but somewhat shallow aristocrat into a man who understood struggle, who had faced despair and chose hope, who knew what it meant to be broken and still stand up. The crucible of fire had done its work. Franklin Roosevelt was ready, though he did not yet know it, to lead his nation through trials that would test every lesson polio had taught him. The phoenix was rising from the ashes, and soon a broken nation would need him in ways neither he nor they could possibly imagine. The Phoenix Rising. 1924 and 1932 were years of preparation, though Franklin did not know he was preparing for anything beyond his own survival. He divided his time between Warm Springs, where he continued his rehabilitation and worked to build the Polio Treatment Center, and New York, where he slowly re-engaged with politics under Louis Howe's careful guidance. In 1928, Al Smith, now the Democratic nominee for president, begged Franklin to run for governor of New York. Smith believed he needed a strong candidate to help carry New York's crucial electoral votes. Franklin was reluctant. He wanted more time at Warm Springs, more time to work on his legs, more time before facing the scrutiny of a statewide campaign. But Smith was insistent, and ultimately, Franklin agreed. The campaign revealed just how effectively Franklin had learned to conceal his disability. He traveled across New York State giving speeches, always arriving at venues by car so he could be helped into position before crowds assembled. He spoke from balconies and platforms where his wheelchair was hidden. He projected energy, enthusiasm, and strength. His opponents tried to make an issue of his health, questioning whether a man who could not walk could handle the demands of governing. Franklin responded with humor and defiance, proving his vitality by maintaining a punishing schedule that would have exhausted many able-bodied men. He won the governorship, while Smith lost the presidency. On January 1, 1929, Franklin Roosevelt became governor of New York, one of the most powerful political positions in the nation. He brought to Albany a team of talented advisors, including Frances Perkins, who would become America's first female cabinet secretary, and Harry Hopkins, who would become one of his closest confidants. Together, they began experimenting with progressive reforms, labor protections, old age pensions, public works programs, conservation initiatives. Then, in October 1929, the world changed. The stock market crashed, not just declining, but collapsing, with a violence that shook the foundations of American capitalism. In the months that followed, the crash revealed itself as merely the first symptom of a far deeper disease. Banks failed by the thousands, wiping out the savings of millions. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. Farms foreclosed. Families lost their homes and took to the roads, searching desperately for work that did not exist. By 1932, the Great Depression had transformed America into a landscape of desperation. In cities, bread lines stretched for blocks. Shantytowns constructed from scrap metal and cardboard, sardonically named Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up in parks and vacant lots. In rural areas, dust storms began to sweep across once fertile plains, turning the sky black and burying farms beneath mountains of dirt. Approximately 13 million Americans were unemployed, nearly a quarter of the workforce. Many who still had jobs worked for starvation wages. Children went hungry. Families broke apart under the strain. President Hoover, a brilliant engineer who had organized relief efforts after World War I, seemed paralyzed by the crisis. He clung to traditional economic theories that insisted the government should not interfere in the marketplace, that the depression would correct itself if given time. He provided some limited relief, but it was nowhere near enough. The American people, watching their nation crumble, began to lose faith not just in Hoover, but in democracy itself. Communist and fascist movements gained followers who believed capitalism had failed and needed to be replaced with something new. Franklin Roosevelt watched this unfolding catastrophe with a growing sense that destiny was calling. As governor, he had pushed for aggressive state action to combat unemployment and provide relief. He understood, in a way Hoover did not, that the depression was not just an economic problem, but a crisis of confidence, a psychological wound as deep as any physical injury. The American people needed to believe again, needed to hope again, needed someone to tell them they had not been abandoned. In the summer of 1932, Democrats gathered in Chicago for their national convention. Franklin was the front-runner for the presidential nomination, but not without opposition. Several ballots were required before he finally secured the nomination. Then he did something unprecedented. Traditionally, nominees waited weeks before formally accepting. Franklin chartered an airplane and flew immediately to Chicago, a dramatic gesture in an era when air travel was still dangerous and exotic. He strode to the podium, supported by his son James, and delivered his acceptance speech. "I pledge you, I pledge myself," he declared, his voice rising with passion, "to a new deal for the American people." The phrase, "New Deal," was not particularly original, but it captured something the nation desperately needed: the promise of action, of change, of hope. Franklin did not have a complete plan. He would later admit that many of his ideas were contradictory, that he was willing to try anything to see what worked. But he had something more important than a plan. He had the ability to make people believe that someone was finally going to fight for them. The campaign of 1932 was never really a contest. Hoover, decent and well-meaning but hopelessly out of touch, defended his policies and insisted recovery was just around the corner. Franklin traveled the country by train, giving speeches that mixed specific proposals with emotional appeals, telling Americans they had nothing to fear but fear itself. He projected confidence and optimism even as he acknowledged the depth of the crisis. He made people laugh. He made them hope. On Election Day, Roosevelt won in a landslide, carrying 42 of 48 states. But his victory came with a terrifying burden. Between the November election and his March inauguration, the depression grew even worse. Banks were failing at an accelerating rate. By Inauguration Day, the banking system had essentially collapsed. Most states had declared banking holidays, closing their banks to prevent total ruin. Millions of Americans had no access to their savings. The nation was in full panic, teetering on the edge of complete economic and social collapse. Punished on March 4, 1933, a cold, grey day in Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office as the 32nd President of the United States. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes administered the oath. Franklin placed his hand on his family's Dutch Bible and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Then he turned to face 100,000 people gathered before the Capitol and millions more listening on radios across the nation. Constituted address lasted only 20 minutes, but it would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. He spoke in simple, direct language that everyone could understand. He acknowledged the scale of the disaster without sugarcoating its severity. He called for action, for experimentation, for bold, persistent effort. And he gave the nation the message it desperately needed to hear. This great nation will endure, as it has endured, will revive, and will prosper, he declared. So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Fear itself. That was the enemy. Not just unemployment or bank failures, but the psychological paralysis that made action seem impossible. Franklin understood this because he had faced his own paralyzing fear and overcome it. He had lain helpless in bed on Campobello Island, his body useless, his future apparently destroyed, and he had chosen to fight. Now he was asking the nation to make the same choice, to fight, to hope, to believe that recovery was possible. The words echoed across the nation. On farms and in factories, Americans listened and began to feel something they had not felt in years. Hope. Perhaps this man, this crippled aristocrat who spoke with such confidence and compassion, could actually lead them out of the darkness. Perhaps everything was not lost after all. Franklin concluded his speech with a warning and a promise. If Congress would not act, he declared, he would ask for broad executive power to wage war against the emergency, the kind of power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. It was a remarkable assertion of presidential authority, one that would have seemed dictatorial in normal times. But these were not normal times, and the American people were ready to follow anyone who would lead them. The phoenix had risen from its ashes. The man who had been broken by disease and forged by struggle was ready to lead a broken nation through its greatest trial since the Civil War. The New Deal was about to begin, and with it, a transformation of American government and society that would echo through generations. Franklin Roosevelt had spent 12 years learning to stand again. Now he would teach a nation to do the same. The 100 Days. Heroin Roosevelt hit the ground running, moving with a speed and decisiveness that shocked Washington. On his second day in office, he declared a national banking holiday, closing every bank in America for 4 days. It was a drastic step, but it gave his administration time to separate viable banks from failing ones and to craft legislation that would prevent total collapse. On March 9th, just 5 days after his inauguration, Roosevelt called Congress into special session. What followed would be remembered as the 100 Days, a whirlwind of legislative activity unmatched in American history. Between March 9th and June 16th, Congress passed 15 major bills that fundamentally restructured the relationship between the federal government and the American people. The Emergency Banking Act came first, passed by Congress in less than 8 hours. Most representatives never even read the bill. They simply trusted Roosevelt and voted yes. The act gave the president power to regulate banking transactions and foreign exchange. It provided for the reopening of solvent banks under Treasury Department supervision. It authorized the Federal Reserve to issue emergency currency. In one day, Roosevelt nationalized the banking system without nationalizing the banks themselves. But Roosevelt understood that technical fixes were not enough. The The banking system had collapsed because Americans had lost faith in it. To restore that faith, he needed to speak directly to the people. On Sunday evening, March 12th, 8 days after his inauguration, Roosevelt gave the first of what would become known as his fireside chats. Crimson Sydney million Americans gathered around their radios to listen as the president explained, in simple language anyone could understand, what had gone wrong with the banks and what his administration was doing to fix it. He did not talk down to his audience or hide behind technical jargon. He spoke as if he was sitting in their living rooms, a friend explaining a difficult situation. "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking," he began, his voice warm and conversational. He explained how banks worked, why they had failed, and why the ones reopening would be safe. "It is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress," he assured them. The impact was immediate and profound. When banks reopened the next day, deposits exceeded withdrawals. Americans brought their hidden cash back to the banking system. Roosevelt had accomplished through communication what no amount of legislation could achieve alone. He had restored confidence. The banking crisis, which had seemed unsolvable, was essentially over within weeks. The 100 days continued at a breathtaking pace. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created, putting young men to work in forests and parks, planting trees, fighting fires, building trails. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided direct grants to states for unemployment relief. The Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to raise crop prices by paying farmers to reduce production, addressing the desperate situation in rural America where prices had fallen so low that farmers were burning crops rather than paying to ship them to market. The Tennessee Valley Authority, perhaps the most ambitious program of all, was authorized to build dams and power plants across one of the poorest regions of America, bringing electricity to rural areas for the first time. The National Industrial Recovery Act established codes to eliminate unfair competition, set minimum wages and maximum hours, and guarantee labor's right to organize. The Securities Act began the process of regulating Wall Street to prevent the kind of speculation that had contributed to the crash. Each law addressed a different aspect of the crisis. Each represented a departure from traditional government philosophy. The federal government was taking on responsibilities that had previously been left to states, cities, or private charity. Roosevelt was not particularly ideological about these choices. He was pragmatic, willing to try anything that might work, willing to abandon what failed. "Take a method and try it," he said. "If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." Not everyone approved. Conservatives howled that Roosevelt was destroying capitalism, creating socialism, trampling on the Constitution. Business leaders who had begged for government help during the crisis now complained about regulation and interference. The Supreme Court, dominated by conservative justices, began striking down New Deal programs as unconstitutional. But Roosevelt had something his critics did not: the support of the American people. Farmers whose homes had been saved from foreclosure did not care about constitutional theory. Workers who finally had jobs after years of unemployment did not worry about federal overreach. Families who could afford to eat again were not concerned about balanced budgets. The New Deal was working, not perfectly, not completely, but well enough that people could see improvement, could feel hope returning. Pressured, Roosevelt's first year in office saw unemployment begin to fall. Industrial production began to rise, prices stabilized. The nation was not yet recovered, but it had stopped falling into the abyss. Just as importantly, the psychological climate began to shift. Americans no longer felt abandoned. They had a government that was fighting for them, a president who understood their struggles and was willing to experiment until he found solutions. Eleanor Roosevelt became Franklin's eyes and ears across the nation. While he could not easily travel, she went everywhere, visiting mines and factories, slums and farms, reporting back to him about conditions she observed. She challenged him to do more for African Americans and women, groups that the New Deal often overlooked or actively discriminated against. She held her own press conferences, wrote her own newspaper column, and became a public figure in her own right, advocating for social justice and human rights. Their partnership had evolved into something remarkable. They no longer shared a bedroom or a romantic relationship, but they shared a mission. They pushed each other, disagreed, argued, and ultimately strengthened each other's work. Franklin provided the political skill and charisma. Eleanor provided the moral conscience and the willingness to challenge him when he was wrong. Together, they formed one of the most effective political partnerships in American history. By the summer of 1933, when the 100 Days finally ended, America was a different country than it had been in March. The federal government had grown enormously. New agencies, quickly nicknamed alphabet agencies from their initials, CCC, AAA, TVA, NRA, FERA, employed millions of people and distributed billions of dollars. The Constitution, as Roosevelt had promised in his inaugural address, had been reshaped not through formal amendment, but through new interpretations of old powers. Pedestrian, some of Roosevelt's programs worked brilliantly. Others failed spectacularly and were quietly abandoned. But the overall effect was transformational. The federal government had established a new relationship with its citizens, accepting responsibility for their welfare in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Social Security would come later, establishing a permanent safety net for the elderly. Labor protections would become standard. Banking regulations would prevent future crashes. The modern American state, for better and worse, was being born in those frenetic 100 days. Pregnant on the left complained that Roosevelt had saved capitalism when he should have replaced it. Critics on the right insisted he had destroyed capitalism by regulating it. Roosevelt ignored both groups. He had not saved or destroyed anything. He had simply refused to stand by while his nation drowned. He had chosen action over paralysis, experimentation over ideology, hope over despair. The phoenix had spread its wings, the nation was rising, but the flight would not be smooth or easy. Ahead lay more struggles, more crises, more moments when everything seemed to teeter on the edge. And eventually, a storm would come that would make the Depression seem like a prelude, a war that would test every lesson Roosevelt had learned and demand every ounce of strength he possessed. But for now, in the summer of 1933, as Americans planted gardens and built bridges and began to believe again, the future seemed brighter than it had in years. The man who had refused to surrender had taught his nation to do the same. The voice that united a nation. In the years that followed the 100 Days, Franklin Roosevelt developed and perfected the most powerful weapon any president had ever wielded: his voice. Radio had been around for a decade, but no politician had truly understood its potential until Roosevelt. Previous presidents who attempted radio addresses sounded stiff and formal, reading their speeches like legal documents. Roosevelt transformed the medium into an instrument of intimacy and power. Polluted, 1933 and 1944, Roosevelt delivered approximately 30 fireside chats, though scholars debate the exact number because the definition of what constituted a fireside chat versus a regular radio address was fluid. What mattered was not the count, but the impact. When the president spoke, America listened. During his most popular addresses, up to 70% of Americans with radios tuned in. Entire neighborhoods gathered around single sets. Families rearranged their evening schedules to be home when the president spoke. Bars fell silent. Traffic thinned. The nation paused to hear Roosevelt's voice. The name Fireside Chat itself had not been Roosevelt's creation. After his second radio address in May 1933, CBS executive Harry Butcher described it as the president coming into people's homes for a little fireside chat. The phrase captured perfectly what Roosevelt was attempting. He was not delivering a speech, he was having a conversation with friends. Roosevelt prepared for these broadcasts with meticulous care. He and his team of speechwriters would go through 6 or more drafts, refining every word. But Roosevelt never simply read from a script. He would rehearse, making notes in the margins, crossing out words that looked good on paper but sounded awkward when spoken. He memorized key passages so he could deliver them without breaking the illusion that he was speaking spontaneously. The content of the chats themselves was carefully crafted for maximum clarity. 70% of the words Roosevelt used came from the 500 most common words in the English language. He spoke slowly, using about 65 fewer words per minute than typical radio announcers. He employed simple analogies that anyone could understand. When explaining Lend-Lease to Britain, he compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You would not worry about the cost of the hose while the fire raged. You would want your neighbor to use it and return it when the crisis passed. But Roosevelt's genius went beyond the words themselves. His delivery was conversational, warm, intimate. Francis Perkins, his Labour secretary, described watching him deliver a fireside chat. His head would nod, and his hands would move in simple, natural, comfortable gestures. His face would smile and light up, as though he were actually sitting on the front porch or in the parlor. He made 70 million people feel like he was talking directly to each of them. Blindness. The fireside chats addressed every major challenge of Roosevelt's presidency. In March 1933, he explained the banking crisis. In May, he outlined his New Deal programs. In June 1934, he reported on progress made and challenges remaining. In October 1933, he discussed the National Recovery Administration. Each chat built trust, explaining complex policies in terms ordinary Americans could grasp, always ending with expressions of confidence and optimism. Roosevelt opened most chats by addressing his listeners as "my friends," a small phrase that carried enormous weight. He was not their superior, not their ruler. He was their friend, someone who cared about them, someone who shared their concerns. He used first-person and second-person pronouns, I and you, creating a direct connection. He referred to himself and his listeners as we, building a sense of shared purpose and mutual struggle. The chats also served a strategic purpose. They allowed Roosevelt to bypass the newspapers, many of which were owned by conservative publishers who opposed the New Deal. He could speak directly to voters, presenting his policies in the most favorable light, countering criticism before it could take root. Conservative newspapers editorialized against him, but millions of Americans heard his voice in their homes and decided they trusted the man they heard more than the words they read. Roosevelt's communication skills extended beyond radio. His press conferences, held regularly throughout his presidency, were masterpieces of political theater. He held nearly 1,000 press conferences over 12 years, an average of about one every 3.5 days. He was accessible, charming, and skillful at deflecting difficult questions with humor while providing reporters with the stories they needed. He understood that a free press was both an adversary and an ally. He courted reporters, called them by their first names, joked with them, and occasionally tried to manipulate them. He made deals, information in exchange for favorable coverage, exclusives for trusted correspondence. The press, in turn, cooperated in concealing his disability, rarely photographing his wheelchair or describing his inability to walk. This was not entirely selfless. Reporters genuinely liked Roosevelt, and they understood that revealing his full disability might end his presidency, which most of them did not want to see happen. The fireside chats took on new urgency as international crises multiplied in the late 1930s. Hitler had seized power in Germany. Japan was invading China. Italy was conquering Ethiopia. Civil war raged in Spain. Roosevelt understood, earlier than most Americans, that these were not isolated incidents, but signs of a gathering storm that would eventually engulf the world. But America in the 1930s was profoundly isolationist. The horrors of World War I were still fresh in memory. Millions of Americans believed the United States had been tricked into that war, British propaganda, and greedy arms manufacturers. Congress had passed strict neutrality acts designed to prevent America from being dragged into another European conflict. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming opposition to any military involvement overseas. Roosevelt had to navigate carefully. He believed America's security required Britain and France to survive, but he could not say so directly without political suicide. So he began slowly, incrementally, shifting American policy while maintaining the fiction of neutrality. He pushed for and won repeal of the arms embargo, allowing Britain and France to purchase American weapons on a cash-and-carry basis. He secured passage of Lend-Lease, which provided massive military aid to Britain after cash ran out. He authorized naval patrols that brought American ships increasingly close to combat with German submarines. And through it all, he used his fireside chats to prepare the American people for what he knew was coming. In December 1940, after France had fallen and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Roosevelt delivered a chat that would be remembered for one haunting phrase. "America," he said, "must become the great arsenal of democracy. The United States might not send soldiers yet, but it would provide the weapons, the supplies, the industrial might that would enable democracies to survive." The response was overwhelming. An estimated 59% of Americans with radios listened, and many who heard the chat wrote to the White House. In the days after the address, the White House received 40,000 letters, most supporting Roosevelt's position. He had moved public opinion without seeming to push, explained necessity without demanding sacrifice, prepared his nation for war while maintaining peace. Rockefeller's deserves greatest communication challenge still lay ahead. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in December 1941, news would arrive that would change everything. The president, who had used words to heal a nation's economic wounds, would need to find new words to rally it for the greatest war in human history. The voice that had brought comfort in the Depression would need to inspire courage in the face of unprecedented danger. And Roosevelt, the man who had learned to stand when his legs would not carry him, would need to teach his nation to stand against an enemy that seemed invincible. The fireside chats had prepared America for this moment without most Americans realizing it. For 8 years, Roosevelt had been building trust, establishing credibility, creating a bond between himself and the people that would prove unbreakable. When the storm finally broke, when Americans needed someone to guide them through the darkness, they knew who to listen to. They knew they could trust the voice coming through their radios, the voice of their friend, the voice of their president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Gathering Storm. December 7th, 1941, began as an ordinary Sunday at the White House. Franklin Roosevelt was having lunch with his friend and advisor, Harry Hopkins, discussing the deteriorating situation with Japan. For months, tensions had been escalating. Japan's invasion of China, its occupation of French Indochina, its alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy all pointed toward eventual conflict. The United States had responded with economic sanctions, cutting off oil and steel shipments that Japan's war machine desperately needed. Diplomatic negotiations had been ongoing, but Roosevelt and his advisors did not believe Japan's government was negotiating in good faith. Something was coming. They just did not know what or when. 40 in the afternoon, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox burst into the dining room, his face pale. "Mr. President, it appears that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the news, then asked Knox to gather more information. Over the next few hours, reports flooded in, each one worse than the last. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, had been devastated. Battleships were sinking, aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Thousands of Americans were dead or wounded. That evening, Roosevelt called his cabinet together. The men who assembled were stunned, angry, frightened. How had this happened? How had Japan managed such a surprise attack? Why had there been no warning? Roosevelt listened to their questions and concerns, then calmly began discussing what needed to be done. Congress would need to declare war. The military would need to mobilize. The American people would need to be told. The next day, December 8, 1941, Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress. He had spent the previous evening crafting his speech with careful attention, knowing that his words would resonate through history. His first draft had begun with a detailed recitation of diplomatic failures and Japanese duplicity. But he recognized that was wrong. Americans did not need explanations right now. They needed clarity. They needed a rallying cry. A sunset that would become one of the most famous in American history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech lasted only 6 minutes. Roosevelt described the attacks on Pearl Harbor and other American and British targets across the Pacific. He noted that the assault had come even as Japanese diplomats in Washington were still engaged in negotiations, emphasizing the treachery of the attack. He stated with absolute certainty that America would win through to absolute victory. Synchronized asked Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. Within an hour, Congress had voted. The Senate approved unanimously. In the House, only one member voted no. Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into World War I. By the end of the day, America was at war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The reasons were complex, involving treaty obligations and Hitler's belief that America would be tied down in the Pacific and unable to intervene effectively in Europe. But the effect was simple. America was now fighting a two-front war against enemies on opposite sides of the globe. The situation was desperate. Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet. Japanese forces were sweeping through Southeast Asia, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. In Europe, Nazi Germany controlled everything from the English Channel to the outskirts of Moscow. Britain was holding on, but could not win alone. The Soviet Union was reeling from German invasion, suffering catastrophic losses. The Axis powers seemed unstoppable. Roosevelt understood that America faced the greatest crisis in its history. He also understood that this war would require mobilization on a scale the nation had never attempted. Every factory would need to be converted to war production. Millions of men would need to be drafted and trained. Women would need to enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The entire economy would need to be restructured for total war. But first, Americans needed to believe they could win. They needed someone to tell them with absolute conviction that victory was possible. On December 9th, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat to an anxious nation. The sudden criminal attacks perpetrated by the Japanese in the Pacific provide the climax of a decade of international immorality, he began. He traced the history of Japanese, German, and Italian aggression, explaining how the Axis powers had spent years preparing for this war, while democracies had hoped for peace. Now, he said, there was no choice but to fight. But Roosevelt did not dwell on danger or despair. Instead, he painted a picture of American strength and determination. "We are now in this war," he declared. "We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history." More than 60 million Americans listened, the largest audience for any presidential address up to that time. They heard their president speak with calm confidence about the challenges ahead. They heard him acknowledge that the war would require sacrifices from everyone. They heard him express absolute certainty in ultimate victory. And they believed him, because for 8 years he had never lied to them, never promised them easy solutions, never failed to acknowledge hard truths. Roosevelt quickly established himself as the nation's war leader. He worked closely with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, forging partnership that would prove crucial to Allied victory. The two men had met briefly during World War I, when Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, they became partners in the greatest struggle of their lives. Churchill visited Washington just weeks after Pearl Harbor for a conference codenamed Arcadia. The two leaders, along with their military chiefs, hammered out the basic strategy for fighting the war. Germany first. Despite American fury at Japan for Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Nazi Germany posed the greater threat and had to be defeated before Japan. This decision was controversial and remains debated by historians, but it reflected Roosevelt's understanding that if Germany conquered Britain and the Soviet Union, America would face an unbeatable enemy. Roosevelt also insisted on unconditional surrender as the only acceptable end to the war. There would be no negotiations, no armistice, no treaty that left fascist regimes in power. The Axis would be completely defeated, their governments destroyed, their leaders put on trial. This hardline position unified the Allies and gave them a clear objective, but it also guaranteed a long, brutal conflict. The president's day-to-day routine transformed into an exhausting marathon of meetings, decisions, and crises. He typically woke at 8:30 in the morning, had breakfast in bed while reading reports and newspapers, then began a series of meetings that often lasted until midnight. He met with military commanders, cabinet members, congressional leaders, foreign diplomats, and intelligence officials. He made decisions about grand strategy and minute details. Where to invade, which general to promote, how much steel to allocate to tank production versus ship construction. His physical condition was deteriorating under the strain. Polio had left him with limited mobility, but for years he had managed reasonably well with his wheelchair and leg braces. Now, the constant stress, the sleepless nights, and the weight of responsibility began to take their toll. His blood pressure rose dangerously. He developed heart problems. Photographs from the war years show a man aging rapidly, his face growing gaunt, dark circles deepening under his eyes. Eleanor worried about him, but she also understood that he could not slow down. The war consumed him because he believed, correctly, that his leadership was essential to victory. He was the one who could manage the coalition of allies, each with their own interests and agendas. He was the one who could maintain public support for a war that would require years of sacrifice. He was the one who could make the hard choices about how to deploy limited resources against unlimited demands. He also authorized actions that would haunt his legacy. In February 1942, responding to war hysteria and racist fears, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens. They were forced from their homes, given just days to sell or store their possessions, and sent to detention camps in remote areas. There was no evidence of disloyalty, no justification beyond prejudice and panic. Roosevelt knew this was wrong, but he signed the order anyway, one of the greatest moral failures of his presidency. The war ground on through 1942 and into 1943. American forces stopped the Japanese advance at Midway, destroying 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and turning the tide in the Pacific. In North Africa, British and American forces defeated the Afrika Korps. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army held at Stalingrad and began pushing the Germans back. Slowly, painfully, the Allies were winning. unless Roosevelt understood that military victory alone was not enough. He began planning for the post-war world even as the war raged. He envisioned an organization that would prevent future wars, a United Nations where countries could resolve disputes peacefully. He met with Stalin and Churchill at Tehran in 1943 and Yalta in 1945, negotiating the shape of the post-war order, making compromises he believed necessary to maintain the alliance. Through it all, Roosevelt continued his fires as people know. The war of military was no fool that his features forgiven Della and limited him. Through it all, Roosevelt continued on the war. He explained military strategy using maps, urging listeners to follow along as he described the global conflict. He acknowledged setbacks and losses while maintaining optimism about ultimate victory. He asked for sacrifice, rationing, and patience, and the American people responded, working longer hours in factories, buying war bonds, accepting shortages, sending their sons and husbands and fathers off to fight. By early 1944, victory seemed inevitable, just a matter of time. The D-Day invasion of France in June broke German power in the West. Soviet forces were driving toward Berlin from the east. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan itself. The Axis was collapsing. But Roosevelt was collapsing too. He had been president for over 11 years, longer than anyone in American history. He had led the nation through the Depression and through the greatest war ever fought. He had reshaped American government, transforming it from a limited entity into a powerful force that touched every aspect of national life. He had done all this while paralyzed from the waist down, while in constant pain, while maintaining a facade of vigor that hid his true condition. In November 1944, Americans elected Roosevelt to an unprecedented fourth term, though by a smaller margin than his previous victories. They could see he was failing, but they could not imagine anyone else leading them to victory. He was the only president many Americans had ever known. He was the voice that had comforted them in the Depression and inspired them in war. They would follow him to the end. That end was coming faster than anyone realized. In March 1945, Roosevelt addressed Congress about the Yalta Conference, speaking from his wheelchair, rather than standing at a lectern for the first time. "I hope you will pardon me for the unusual posture of sitting down," he said. "But I know you will realize it makes it a lot easier for me, not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs." The admission shocked many who heard it. Roosevelt had never spoken so openly about his disability. He looked terrible, his face grey, his hands trembling, his voice occasionally faltering. But he delivered his message. The war was almost won. The United Nations would ensure peace. The sacrifices had been worth it. Then he left Washington for the last time, traveling to Warm Springs, Georgia, the place where he had learned to fight again, the place where he had rediscovered hope after polio destroyed his legs. He needed rest. He needed warmth. He needed to remember why he had kept fighting when it would have been easier to surrender. He needed, perhaps, to say goodbye to the place that had given him back his life. On April 12, 1945, surrounded by friends and the Georgia spring he loved, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would keep his final appointment with destiny. The final journey. 12th, 1945, dawned bright and warm in Warm Springs, Georgia. Roosevelt slept late, exhausted from months of grueling labor. The Yalta Conference in February had drained him more than any previous ordeal. For 8 days, he had negotiated with Stalin and Churchill, trying to shape the post-war world while his body betrayed him. He returned to Washington looking like a man who had aged a decade in months. His doctors were alarmed, but could do little. Roosevelt suffered from hypertension that had gone uncontrolled for years. His heart was failing. Arteriosclerosis narrowed his blood vessels. Congestive heart failure made every breath an effort. Modern medicine might have managed these conditions with drugs and interventions not yet invented in 1945. But in 1945, the best advice doctors could give was rest. So, Roosevelt came to Warm Springs, the place he had discovered in 1924, when he was a man broken by polio, searching for a way to walk again. He had not found a cure for polio here, but he had found something more important: the will to fight, the courage to keep trying, the determination to build a life despite disability. Now, 21 years later, he returned seeking peace and renewal one more time. He brought with him a small party: his cousins Laura Polly Delano and Margaret Daisy Suckley, his secretary Grace Tully, and several Secret Service agents. Also present was Lucy Mercer Rutherford, now widowed and no longer Mercer. Franklin had resumed their relationship years earlier, violating his promise to Eleanor. He had arranged for Lucy to visit him multiple times at the White House and other locations, always when Eleanor was away. Eleanor did not know, or pretended not to know. Lucy had brought Elizabeth Shumatov, a Russian-American society portraitist, to paint Roosevelt's picture. This was to be a gift, a memento of their enduring connection. On the morning of April 12th, Roosevelt dressed carefully in a double-breasted grey suit and his Harvard crimson tie. He positioned himself in his favorite leather chair before the stone fireplace in the cottage's living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Shumatov set up her easel and began to sketch. Crimson Roosevelt worked while she painted, signing papers and reading documents that had arrived from Washington. He joked with his cousins. He discussed plans for the afternoon, which included a barbecue at a nearby cottage and an evening minstrel show put on by patients at the Warm Springs Foundation. Tomorrow, he would give a brief radio address for Jefferson Day celebrations. In a few days, he would return to Washington. Then he would travel to San Francisco for the opening of the United Nations Conference on April 25th, the conference that would establish the organization he hoped would prevent future wars. He was looking forward to it all. Despite his exhaustion, despite his failing health, Roosevelt maintained his optimistic nature. He believed victory in Europe was weeks away. Japan would follow in a few months. The United Nations would be established. Peace would be secured. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved democracy from depression and fascism. He could rest soon. At about 1 in the afternoon, a mess boy began setting the table for lunch. Roosevelt looked at Shumatov and said, "We have about 15 more minutes." Then he raised his left hand to his temple, his fingers moving in a strange, wandering motion. His face contorted with pain. "I have a terrific headache," he said, his voice suddenly weak. Then he slumped forward in his chair, unconscious. For a moment, the room froze in shocked silence. Then everyone moved at once. His valets, Arthur Prettyman and Joe Esperancia, rushed in and carried Roosevelt's limp body to the bedroom, laying him on the plain maple bed. Daisy Suckley called for Dr. Howard Brune, Roosevelt's cardiologist, who was staying at a nearby cottage. Polly Delano called Eleanor in Washington. Brune arrived within minutes. One look told him what had happened. Roosevelt had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke so severe that Brune knew immediately there was no hope. The president's blood pressure was 300/190, wildly high, dangerously high. His breathing was labored and irregular. He was in a coma from which he would never wake. Lucy Mercer Rutherford and Elizabeth Shumatov quietly packed their belongings and left, expecting Eleanor to arrive soon. The portrait Shumatov had been painting remained unfinished, Roosevelt's features sketched but incomplete. They took it with them. For years afterward, the portrait's existence remained a secret, another hidden chapter in Roosevelt's complicated personal life. Dr. Brune called for Dr. James Paulin, a specialist from Atlanta. Paulin arrived around 3:30 but could do nothing. Roosevelt's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, more irregular. His pulse weakened. At 3:35 p.m., Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. He was 63 years old. Dr. Brune pronounced him dead from a cerebral hemorrhage. They did not perform an autopsy. The cause was obvious. The president had literally worked himself to death, driven by a sense of duty that would not allow him to rest until his task was complete. He had held on long enough to see victory in sight, but not long enough to see it achieved. Eleanor was in Washington when the call came from Warm Springs. She was told only that Franklin had fainted. She finished her scheduled speaking engagement, then returned to the White House. Only when she entered her sitting room did aides tell her the truth. Franklin was dead. She sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the news, then called their sons, all of whom were on active military duty. Her first question to the aides was typically Eleanor. "What can I do?" They told her she needed to go to Warm Springs to handle funeral arrangements. She flew down that evening on a military plane, arriving at 11:30 p.m. When she entered the cottage where Franklin had died, she saw the unfinished portrait and understood immediately. Lucy had been there. Her husband had been with his mistress when he died. Years later, Eleanor would write about that night with characteristic restraint. "I was deeply unhappy," she said, but also acknowledged that Franklin had the right to seek comfort where he chose. Their marriage had become a political partnership built on mutual respect rather than romantic love. She had her life, he had his. They had worked together to change the world. Perhaps that was enough. The next day, Roosevelt's body began its slow journey from Warm Springs to Washington by train. The coffin was loaded onto a special car, draped in black bunting. As the train moved north through Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, thousands of people lined the tracks. They stood in silent rows, many weeping openly, paying their last respects to the president who had led them through the Depression and the war. In cities and small towns, at crossroads and railway stations, Americans gathered to watch the train pass, to be present for this final journey. A musician named Graham Jackson stood by the tracks in Georgia with his accordion. As the train approached, he began to play Dvorak's Going Home, tears streaming down his face. A photographer captured the image. Jackson's anguished face, his fingers moving across the keys, the train carrying Roosevelt's body passing in the background. The photograph would become one of the most iconic images of that day, capturing the profound grief millions of Americans felt. In Washington, Roosevelt's body lay in state in the East Room of the White House. Tens of thousands of mourners filed past the coffin. Then, the funeral procession moved to Union Station, where another train carried the president's body north to Hyde Park, New York, where he had been born 63 years earlier. On April 15, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was buried in the Rose Garden at Springwood, his family estate overlooking the Hudson River. Eleanor stood beside the grave, her face composed, her eyes dry. She had wept privately, but would not weep in public. She was not that kind of woman. Their children stood with her, young men in military uniforms, grieving for the father they had both loved and felt they had never quite known. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Eleanor laid a bouquet of flowers on it. Then she turned away, returning to the house where Franklin had been born and raised, where he had learned to sail on the Hudson and ride horses through the estate. The boy who had been born here had become the man who reshaped America and saved democracy. Now he was home. His legacy remained alive in every American who had benefited from Social Security, in every worker protected by labor laws, in every family saved by banking regulations, in every nation freed from fascist tyranny. Franklin Roosevelt had died, but the world he had helped create would endure. The Phoenix had made its final flight, but the flames it left behind would light the way for generations to come. The Eternal Flame. Harry Truman, who had been vice president for less than 3 months, became President of the United States within hours of Roosevelt's death. Truman had been kept in the dark about many crucial matters, including the development of the atomic bomb. Now he had to make decisions about ending the war and shaping the peace. decisions that Roosevelt had been preparing for years to make. Truman would later say that when Roosevelt died, he felt as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. Pressure had prepared the ground, even if Truman did not yet know it. Less than 3 weeks after Roosevelt's death, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In August, after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered too. The war was won, the greatest victory in American history, achieved largely through the mobilization Roosevelt had organized and the alliances he had forged. Pedestrians was established in San Francisco, the conference Roosevelt had planned to attend. The organization he had envisioned, where nations could resolve disputes peacefully under a framework of international law, became reality. It was imperfect, compromised, often frustrated by the same power politics it was meant to transcend. But it existed, and for 75 years and counting, it has helped prevent another world war. Roosevelt's domestic legacy proved even more enduring. The New Deal had transformed the relationship between the American government and its people. Social Security provided a safety net for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed, becoming one of the most popular and successful government programs ever created. Labor laws established minimum wages, maximum hours, and the right to organize, lifting millions of workers into the middle class. Banking regulations prevented a repeat of the 1929 crash for decades. Conservation programs planted 3 billion trees and created national parks that millions still enjoy. The modern American state, with all its complexity and contradictions, is Roosevelt's creation. The idea that government should actively manage the economy, provide a social safety net, regulate business to protect consumers and workers, and ensure a basic standard of living for all citizens, these were not American assumptions before Roosevelt. After him, they became fundamental expectations that even conservative politicians could not entirely dismantle. Critics on both the left and right have spent decades arguing about Roosevelt's legacy. Conservatives claim he created an overreaching federal government that stifles individual initiative and economic freedom. Progressives point out that the New Deal largely excluded African Americans from its benefits, that Roosevelt compromised with Southern segregationists to maintain his political coalition, that he interned Japanese Americans, that he did not do enough for the truly oppressed. Both critiques have merit. Roosevelt was neither a saint nor a revolutionary. He was a pragmatic politician who worked within the constraints of his time, making compromises that look shameful in retrospect. The New Deal's benefits flowed primarily to white men, leaving women and minorities to fight for decades to claim equal protection. Roosevelt's personal life was marked by betrayals and deceptions that complicate any simple, heroic narrative. Caregivers, the overall arc of his presidency, remains remarkable. He took office when American democracy seemed on the verge of collapse, when millions were starving, when banks had failed, when capitalism appeared to have destroyed itself. He could have declared himself dictator, and many people would have supported him. Instead, he chose to work within democratic institutions, preserving the Constitution even while stretching its interpretations, maintaining free elections even during war. Pensions he led America through 2 existential crises, an economic depression that threatened the nation's survival and a war that threatened civilization itself. He did so while paralyzed from the waist down, while in constant physical pain, while maintaining an illusion of vigor that hid the reality of his disability. The sheer physical courage required to be president under those conditions, standing for hours at a time on locked braces, traveling despite the difficulties, maintaining a public schedule that would exhaust most able-bodied people, is almost impossible to comprehend. More importantly, he taught Americans something essential during their darkest hours. Hope is not naive optimism, but a choice we make in the face of despair. When Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he was not denying the reality of danger. He was asserting that psychological paralysis was more dangerous than any external threat. This was a lesson he had learned personally in his battle with polio. He had chosen to hope when hopelessness seemed rational. He had chosen to fight when surrender seemed reasonable. And his choice had made all the difference. Roosevelt's fireside chats established a new model of presidential communication that every successor has tried to emulate. He showed that a president could speak directly to the people, bypassing intermediaries, building a personal connection that transcended the limitations of broadcast media. Modern presidents use television, social media, and other technologies, but they are all following the path Roosevelt pioneered, treating communication not as an afterthought, but as a central tool of leadership. Perhaps most importantly, Roosevelt demonstrated that disability does not mean inability. He was the most powerful man in the world while dependent on a wheelchair. He commanded armies while unable to walk. He shaped history while society considered him a cripple. Generations of people with disabilities have drawn inspiration from his example, understanding that limitations can be overcome, that different abilities can be strengths, that what matters is not what your body can do, but what your mind and spirit can achieve. Eleanor Roosevelt lived on until 1962, becoming, in her own right, one of the most influential women of the 20th century. She served as a delegate to the United Nations, where she was instrumental in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She wrote, lectured, and advocated for civil rights, women's rights, and social justice. She became, in many ways, the moral conscience America needed after Franklin's death, the voice reminding the nation of its ideals even when it fell short. Leg or death, historians have consistently ranked him among the three greatest American presidents, usually alongside George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. This is fitting company. Washington gave birth to the nation. Lincoln saved it from destruction. Roosevelt transformed it into the superpower that would dominate the 20th century and preserved democracy during its greatest test. But Roosevelt's greatest achievement may be something harder to quantify. He taught Americans that government could be a force for good, that collective action could solve problems too large for individual effort, that we are responsible for each other's welfare. In an age of increasing cynicism about government, this lesson seems almost quaint, yet it remains essential. Roosevelt was buried at Hyde Park, overlooking the Hudson River, the landscape he had loved since childhood. Eleanor was buried beside him when she died in 1962. Their graves are simple, marked by white marble slabs in the rose garden. No grand monuments, no massive tombs, just two headstones side by side in the earth they had known. But their true monument is America itself, the nation they helped save and reshape. Every time Social Security prevents an elderly person from poverty, every time labor laws protect a worker from exploitation, every time a national park preserves beauty for future generations, every time the United Nations helps prevent a war, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy lives on. Homeland on that April afternoon in 1945, when Franklin raised his hand to his temple and said, "I have a terrific headache." When he slumped forward and left this world, he did not know how his story would be remembered. He did not know that 80 years later, Americans would still invoke his name, still debate his policies, still draw inspiration from his courage. He knew only that he had tried his best, that he had fought every day despite pain and exhaustion, that he had refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. The golden boy from Hyde Park, the privileged youth in the golden cage, the man struck down by polio at the height of his powers, the politician who learned empathy through suffering, the president who saved democracy through leadership and communication, the leader who guided America through its darkest hours, all these versions of Franklin Roosevelt merged into one final truth. He was a man who refused to quit. And in refusing to quit, he taught a nation and a world how to stand when standing seemed impossible, how to hope when hope seemed foolish, how to fight when defeat seemed certain. The phoenix rose from the ashes, and though it has fallen, its flame still burns, lighting the way for all who face their own crucibles, their own trials, their own moments when they must choose between surrender and struggle. Franklin Delano Roosevelt chose to struggle, and because he did, millions of others found the courage to do the same. That is his true legacy, his eternal flame, his gift to the future. In the end, the man who could not walk taught a nation how to stand. The cripple became the hero, the broken vessel became the light that guided millions through darkness into dawn. And on a spring day in Georgia, as the dogwoods bloomed white against the green pines and the warm sun blessed the earth, Franklin Roosevelt closed his eyes for the last time, his journey complete, his work done, his place in history secured. The voice fell silent, but the echo goes on forever, calling to us still. Hope, fight, stand, never surrender, never, ever surrender.